Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Play with AK featuring me, your host Akukami. In this StarCraft 2 episode, we'll be taking a look at a game I played on ladder. This is going to be a TVZ matchup on Shakuras Plateau. Starting off in the 7 o'clock position is me spawning as the red Terran player. Meanwhile, my opponent, Shreya S to the 4th M, will be spawning in the 5 o'clock location as the blue Zerg player. Shreya S to the 4th M. That's funny. Shakuras Plateau, one of those maps I'm very familiar with, as I've known it to be in the map pool selection since Season 1, I believe. Ladder Season 1. It is now Ladder Season 7, for those of you who don't already know, and Shakuras Plateau, one of those surviving maps that's made it all the way through. So, folks at Blizzard, thank you for keeping this map in. Meanwhile, getting back into the game, going to be starting off with that 10 supply depot in my base, going for that at the top of my ramp, going for that wall off here, racks here, followed by another supply depot there to complete that wall off. Meanwhile, my opponent back at his base is not doing much of anything, sending his Overlord scout in the wrong direction, actually sending it out in a location where I cannot spawn. Yes, in this map on Shakuras Plateau, you cannot spawn close ground position, as my opponent has, well, I hope this is to scout for incoming drops, as he probably, well, if he does know it's there and is using, I'm not there and I can't spawn there, and is just using that Overlord to scout for any drops that might come that way, good for him. I mean, yeah, seriously, good for him. Coming out with that 13 refinery, going to be saturating that soon with 2 more SCVs. Meanwhile, trying to finish my racks here so I can move on to here and upgrade my command center to my orbital. Going to be sending out a drone in this location. I think realizing that I'm not there, deciding that he should probably scout the other 2 locations, and, well, probably didn't know that you can't spawn cross a ground location, so lucky for me, he won't find me that soon. Except that I'm going to eat my words right now as he's moving his Overlord into my base. Finally upgrading my command center into an orbital, dropping that mule, going to be going for that factory right after building this supply depot, and going for another marine as my opponent's Overlord makes it into my base very slowly. My opponent spamming 444 backslash because I am lagging and he can't take the pressure. Anyways, my opponent, I think, scouting me out, deciding to move back with his drone, knowing that where I am. Coming over with my 2 marines, going to be shooting down this Overlord, and will explode very shortly. Boom! Meanwhile, coming out with a reactor on my racks, going to be swapping it with my factory and producing those 2 Hellions. Also coming down with my command center. Meanwhile, back at my opponent's base, went for that Baneling nest and is still in one base, which signifies that he's probably going for some kind of Baneling bust at the front of my wall. Going to be swapping that factory and racks. Going to be building my first 2 Hellions and a tech lab on my racks. Just continuing to macro up here, finally taking my second gas in preparation of producing tanks or other gas intensive units. Going to be finishing up my command center. Meanwhile, my opponent has decided to go for that expansion of his own that is natural, and is also researching metabolic boost and is going for a second extractor. So yeah, exciting stuff happening at the opening of this game, and just trying to keep up with it. Going to be building my second racks on my reactor, repositioning my racks, as I am OCD sometimes and not really paying attention to the gameplay, instead paying attention to how my buildings are arranged, and if something is off, I cringe. I really have to stop doing that. Upgrading, meanwhile, my opponent back at his base is upgrading his hatchery to lair, going for that lair tech, probably going for those mutalisks. Meanwhile, not expanding anywhere else on the map, continuing to hold this location here and hold these 2 watchtowers here with his 2 Zerglings. Meanwhile, sending out my own Hellions, going to be scouting for any of these scouting Zerglings, taking out the Zergling there at that watchtower, Forgetting that there are 2 watchtowers at this map. Not really, I just chose not to go for that one. Taking some damage on one of my Hellions, dropping it to red. Going to be going for those drones, which are not there because my opponent moved them back to safety, and using his queen to guard the front of his ramp, trying to do some damage to his hatchery, but as we know, Hellions don't do great against buildings. Forgetting that for the moment, coming out with that second queen, this will be enough to hold off any other Hellion aggression that will be coming soon. Meanwhile, I've lifted my racks and am going to be using it for scouting to see what his tech path is. Meanwhile, back in my base, going for some more Hellions, and yeah, trying to macro up for some more Hellions. Meanwhile, coming out with that armory, and I think you know what's coming behind this. Going to be lifting my orbital command, going to be placing here at my natural. For those of you who don't know what I'm going to do, I'm building Thors with this early armory. Yes, I'm going for mech play. Meanwhile, using my racks to get that scouting down, going to be seeing that my opponent is going to be canceling that spire that he was building and trying to hide his tech from me. Meanwhile, my 6 or 7 Hellions, well, where are they going? Well, they were 6 or 7, trying to guard the front of my opponent's ramp, not letting any drones through so that they can spawn into, they can turn into hatcheries in any other locations. Going to be picking up some of my medevacs, probably going for a drop in the back of his base. Meanwhile, back in my own base, yeah, still on 2 factories as I'm hurting for gas at the moment. Mech in any matchup is really hard to play if you're not keeping track of your gas, as I'm doing a poor job of saturating my gas here. But given that I am a lower level player, I can use that excuse to my advantage as I build my 3rd factory. The advantage of being a lower level player, I can use that excuse all I want. Oversaturating this refinery, forgetting that there were 2 more workers here, but managing to saturate this refinery with the correct amount of workers. Meanwhile, going to be sending my Thor out to the front of my opponent's ramp, trying to reinforce my hold on this location. Meanwhile, my opponent is moving out with his 2 queens, probably trying to break this small contain here, managing to take down 1 Hellion, but not this Thor. Back in my opponent's base, I've gone for a drop, trying to kill off the drones that were there, but my opponent holds this off, and I'm forced to lift off my lonely Hellion as I move my Hellions back to the front of his natural, going to be roasting this queen, taking it down quickly because of my Thor. And back at my base, still hurting for gas and not being able to build anything, coming down with my 4th factory as my opponent is trying to push off this semi-contained so that he can probably move out with his forces, but my Thor is just too much for him at this point. There's my opponent's spire, deciding to put it at his natural and hide that tech away from me, and also coming out with 32 lings. 32 lings. Sometimes it amazes me at how insane Zerg macro can be. You can just bust out 32 attacking units like that. Wow. Just amazing. Meanwhile, back in this location, I've decided to drop my 3rd command center here, going to be turning that into a planetary, or I think it's a planetary. Well, anyways, we'll just find out together later on. Going to be going for that contain once more at the front of my opponent's ramp, trying to use that medevac for vision, and trying to inch closer, trying to pick off any of the forces here, trying to pick off that static defense, and just basically scout what my opponent has. Going to be shooing my medevac away, but not before my my Thor approaches it and backing my Thor off, doing that little jig in the front of his base. Meanwhile, back at my own base, coming down with that 5th factory, really hurting for gas at the moment, trying to build lots of Thors, not being able to do so successfully as my 3rd Thor arrives at his base, and finishing up my command center here, going to be turning that into an orbital or planetary, I forget which one it is. Meanwhile, my opponent is not doing much of anything in his base and is letting the money pile up. Oh my. Anyways, back at my base, not setting up any turrets. Where are my turrets? Oh, I don't even have an engineering bay. Oh my goodness, forgetting to build an engineering bay so that I can have turrets back at my base. Coming down with this very slow and very, very thick moving Thor. Probably tried to come down to this location, realized he was too big, decided to go around my factories. Oh my goodness. Meanwhile, breaking my opponent's forces in the front of his natural. Going to be going for that hatchery here, and if he loses this hatchery, it's pretty much game for him. Meanwhile, coming down with my own command center, will be trying to saturate this really soon as I continue my aggression here, shooting down whatever forces my opponent had at that point. It looked like Zerglings and maybe any stray mutas that could have been in that location, trying to take down this hatchery here. Probably going to be taking it down really soon as my opponent brings in his Zergling army and his Mutalisk, going to be taking out the remainder of my mech forces. Oh my goodness. Managing to hold off my aggression for the time being. However, I do have reinforcements on the way as I decide to turn around, and oh, come on. Why don't I land the Viking over here? Land! Just shoot this! Ugh, frustrating. Anyways, back at my opponent's base. Yeah, not much happening. Going to be going for that Roach. And Roach Warren as he shoots down my poor Viking. If only I had the sense to land this and shoot this down. This hatchery was at one point below 10. Ah, horrible, horrible. Going to be coming out with Roach Warren to fend off my mech army, as roaches, well, I don't know if they do really well against mech, but I do know that if you're caught off guard when they burrow, they're really, really annoying, and they can wreck your army if they're not properly upgraded, or you just simply don't have enough mech units. Meanwhile, still hurting for gas, only just building my 2 refiners here at this location. Meanwhile, sending out... Hello? Okay. Sending out 2 Thors to guard the front of my ramp as my 02 upgrades have finished. Taking down that drone that was probably trying to hatch in this location. Just checking for a base in that location, as at this moment I think he's hurting for minerals. Well, you know, at this point he should be mined out if he's not mining from any other location except these 2 locations. And knowing this, I just guard the front of his ramp, trying to hold off on his economic expansion. Meanwhile, his Zergling surrounding my Thors, but with that O2 upgrades, that +2 armor really helps, sending away my opponent's remaining Zergling forces. And at this point, I realized that he doesn't have too many reinforcing units, so I just decided to go for it. And yeah, going to be tearing through my opponent's static defenses. His spine crawlers are going down. Going to be roasting the spine crawlers with my Hellions, which do really badly, as spine crawlers are considered buildings. Meanwhile, but my Thors managed to rip through his forces and will be finally shooting down that hatchery and taking out my opponent's natural. He doesn't really have any more places to mine from. He doesn't have any reinforcing units, and that's game. Using my Hellions in the beginning of the game to keep my opponent's expansions at bay was really important for me, because I was able to expand behind that contained in the front of his base and just basically keep him there until I was able to move out with my massive mech army and just overwhelm whatever he had at the front of his natural. He could have built some macro hatches in his main base and possibly used up all that money in the bank that you see right now to reinforce his army and possibly produce enough units in order to take out my mech army. My play isn't that great, but fortunately for me, his play wasn't any better than mine, and because of that, he wasn't able to macro up a larger army in order to overwhelm my forces. Well everyone, that wraps it up for this game. If you like my content and videos, please subscribe to my channel, thumbs up and like this video, and as always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on another episode of Let's Play with AK.